Everybody, what's a crack-a-lackin'? We are going to continue our investigation of the age of Jackson today by looking at those who did not like the Democratic Revolution that bears the man's name. We're going to be looking at a political party that arose in opposition to Jackson. They're called the Whigs. And then we're going to be looking at something called judicial nationalism, which is how the Supreme Court reacted to the rise of mass democracy. Let's start by looking back to Thomas Jefferson, who died in 1826, but 2 years before that had a chance to meet Andrew Jackson. He said, "When I was president of the Senate, he was a senator, and could never speak on account of the rashness of his," that's Andrew Jackson's, "feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly, and as often choke with rage. His passions are no doubt cooler now, but he is a dangerous man." Now, you remember, Andrew Jackson looked up to Thomas Jefferson as his hero. Andrew Jackson considered himself a Jeffersonian. Thomas Jefferson thought of Andrew Jackson as a dangerous man. Let's talk about the first political party to emerge out of this mess. They're called the Whigs. Now, take a look at the election of 1828. Once again, the people have spoken. They have spoken in favor of Jackson. You've got a number of people running against Jackson. You've got Henry Clay and two other minor candidates, but they are unable to pull together any kind of united force against Andrew Jackson. The Democratic Republicans, or now we can just speak of them as the Democrats, the Jacksonian Democrats, they have a name brand that people know and people admire. The more conservative members of society, they do not yet have a name that we can identify with. Not yet. So let's just review where we've come so far. Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians, way back near the ratification of the Constitution. The Hamiltonians became the Federalists, the Jeffersonians became the Anti-Federalists, and then their next reincarnation is the Democratic Republicans. During the 1820s, the era of good feelings, were all Republicans. This is because the Federalists did themselves in with that talk of secession during the Hartford Convention. Then you have the more conservative, more Federalist-minded of the Republicans. They split into the National Republicans, and we get the Jacksonian Democrats right around the same year. Then we finally get to the Democrats, and this is where we're going to stay. Now, the Democrats aren't always going to remain true to Andrew Jackson and what he would think, but the party itself is going to remain a cohesive party under the name of the Democrats to the present day. The National Republicans, you're waiting for the Republicans to come up, not quite. They are the Whigs, formed somewhat unofficially in 1833. Who are the Whigs? Let's go on, take a look. The word itself suggests opposition to the use of arbitrary power, such as that exercised by a king. The Whigs were a political party in England during the time of the American Revolution, and the Whig ideology, which suggested republicanism, which suggested opposition to royal authority, that deeply influenced the American Revolution. So who's the king today? Who's the king in question? Who is it that is exercising arbitrary power? You guessed it, Andrew Jackson is the king. At least according to the Whigs, they call him King Andrew I, born to command. Look at the bottom of that poster. Shall he reign over us, or shall the people rule? Well, this is a very interesting use of language because, remember, Andrew Jackson was supposed to be the man of the people, and the Democrats were supposed to be the party of the people. But this group calling themselves the Whigs, they seem to disagree with that, of course. So let's pick apart part of the this poster. There you have Andrew Jackson, and he's dressed up like a king. And of course, this is from a Whig perspective. Let's pick it apart. The Whigs would explain this feature by, well, Andrew Jackson is wearing a crown. Andrew Jackson thinks of himself as a monarch. A monarch is, of course, above the people, and the people are subject to a monarch. And there is Andrew Jackson's veto in his hand. Andrew Jackson was famous for vetoing so many important pieces of legislation. Remember, Andrew Jackson's going to kill the bank. Andrew Jackson wants to veto the Maysfield Road. Andrew Jackson wants to veto a lot of internal improvements that were so important to the national Republicans, to the more federalist-minded group. There he is standing on the Constitution, and it's all ripped up, and he is going to be above it. He's somebody that thinks he's above the law of the land, and there's the evidence of it, the internal improvements and the U.S. Bank. All of these things that the more big government-oriented people, the Whigs or the National Republicans or even some old Federalists thought were a good idea, Andrew Jackson is crushing those. Of course, this is this is propaganda. I happen to think a lot of it's true. You know what I think of Andrew Jackson, but nevertheless, this is a bit of political propaganda to try to make Jackson look like an arbitrary king. So let's take a closer look at the Whigs and their founding fathers. What sort of people bring the Whig Party to life? Well, first you have Daniel Webster, who's a good Yankee from Massachusetts. You have John C. Calhoun. No surprise there. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Why does he oppose Andrew Jackson? Of course, we're looking back to the nullification crisis. So John C. Calhoun no longer going to consider himself to be a good Jacksonian Democrat. And then you have Henry Clay. What do you notice about this? What does this lineup of this lineup of statesmen, not statement, lineup of statesmen tell you about these guys? You have a Northerner, you have a Southerner, and you have a Westerner. This is not going to be a regional party. Whigs are a nationwide party. So let's look at the wonderful Whig worldview. What do they believe in, these Whigs? Well, they believe in a world dominated by men of ability and wealth. They advocate an elite based on talent and not birth. So they're aristocrats, but they're not your standard aristocrats. They are not aristocrats who believe as an aristocrat would in England. We should be dominated by men of ability and wealth, but on talent, not birth. Now, remember this, is this more of a Federalist idea or more of a Republican idea? It goes both ways. It's a compromise for both. You'll have to really decide. I think it's really more Federalist. They believe in the self-made man, the value of labor, and that men could rise from any position to wealth, okay? So here's this bootstrap theory. The belief is that wealth is the result of labor, and labor is available to anybody who wants to get off their butt and work. So a little bit of this is true, a little bit of this is myth. What is it? Is it more Federalist, more Republican? Again, it's a mix of both. It's a mix of both, but I tend to think the Whigs are more the reincarnation of the Federalists. They believe in a strong government hand that can guide economic affairs. They call it a holy alliance between labor, capitalists, and government. Not hard to figure this one out. This one is much more Federalist, right? Big government, government leading the economy, government joining up with capitalists. That is definitely not a Democratic Republican idea, not a Jacksonian idea. This is a Federalist idea. And here's another thing. They also believe in the enforcement of morality through legislation, the benevolent empire. Government exists to make us good. Part of the legitimate role of government is to guide us into being wholesome people. And we saw this with the antebellum reformers. We need good schools. We need alcohol, laws against alcohol. We need laws to clean up the streets. We need strong prisons. This is what's known as the benevolent empire, the idea that government can make us moral and can make us good. This is part of what is driving the anti-slavery movement as well. More Federalist, more Republican. I'm going to go with more Federalist. I don't know that there's an argument here. Federalists definitely do believe that government can be used to enforce morality more than the Democratic Republicans, the Jacksonian Republicans, did. Well, this one, if you have to say, what is it that unites all Whigs, okay? You got a lot of different folks making up the Whigs party. Old states' rights guys who don't like Jackson's veto, who don't like Jackson and the nullification crisis. You have benevolent empire people who want to impose public schools and they want to impose all these morality laws. But here's one thing they all hate. Here's one thing that every card-carrying Whig believes, and that is Andrew Jackson is the devil incarnate. Whigs hate Andrew Jackson, okay? Jackson was a very divisive figure in his day. He appealed to a lot of people, but he did not appeal to those who eventually found a political home in the Whigs. So when it comes up to 1836, we're looking at Martin Van Buren. Now, Martin Van Buren is Andrew Jackson's hand-picked successor, and he pretty much drove his nomination through the Democratic Convention. Martin Van Buren's going to be speaking for the Democrats. And what's going on here? Look at the Whigs. You've got 4 different Whigs. You've got W.P. Magnum, you've got William Henry Harrison, Hugh White, Daniel Webster. All are Whigs. You're thinking, wait a minute, why is the Whig Party trying to run 4 people? Do they plan on losing? I mean, they can't split the presidency 4 ways. What is the Whig Party thinking with this strategy? We do have the 12th Amendment. Let's have a look at it. The person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be the president. If such a number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and no person have such majority, then the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately. That's the 12th Amendment. What's the Whigs' strategy here? They're not trying to get their guys elected. What they are trying to do is get Andrew Jackson to not receive a majority of the electoral votes. If they can divide the electoral votes enough, they might not themselves get somebody. They definitely won't get one of their guys in there, but they will divide the votes enough so that Andrew Jackson will not be elected. And then that vote would go to the House of Representatives, and maybe they'll have a chance there. Well, not quite. The Whig strategy was a failure. Martin Van Buren still popular enough with most of the country, as you can see. He took the majority of the electoral votes, enough to win, and you're looking at Van Buren there with about 50% of the popular vote. William Henry Harrison, the Whig candidate, not trailing too far behind in the popular vote, but still their electoral strategy was a failure. As far as the popular vote, though, pretty interesting, because they almost took half. The Whigs themselves took about half the country in the popular election, but they're not going to come up with enough for the electoral vote. So there's Martin Van Buren, the winner. And let's just take an overview of his presidency. One of these great American failures, I'm afraid. He's going to be your first president to really be known as a Democrat, okay? Andrew Jackson, the party coalesced under him, but he still considers himself a Democratic Republican. The party organizes and starts calling themselves Democrats with Van Buren. Well, you remember Jackson killed the bank, right? Well, when Jackson killed the bank, that turned out to be such a terrible idea, because then, as a direct consequence, most economists think the country falls on pretty tough economic times and brings about the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 is characterized by widespread unemployment. Canal building drops by 90%. You guys know that canal building was a big deal up north, and cotton prices down south are going to be cut in half. So neither north nor south is going to be happy with Andrew Jackson's party led by Martin Van Buren. Now, a consequence of this, and I do want you to really pay attention, is under the presidency of Van Buren, with the first really big panic that we have since the market revolution. You see sort of a new player in American economic life. That's organized labor. They'd been around, sure, but now organized labor really gains momentum. And what we mean by that is something that we call labor unions. They combine with one another, and they tell their employers that we're not going to work, or we're not going to work as much, or we're not going to, or we're going to go on strike until our demands are met. And in tough economic times, people tend to join these labor unions to demand that the government do something about their plight, such as demand public works. They would like the government to put money into building canals, or they'd like the government to put money into building schools or roads or whatever it be, or public relief. So these labor unions, they begin to show up during the Panic of 1837, during Martin Van Buren's presidency. Notice these are working men who are out of work. Orestes Brownson, a labor organizer, says all men will be independent proprietors, working on their own capitals, owning and operating their own farms or in their own shops. This is organized labor's goal. Their goal is not to make a socialist nation, and their goal is not to overturn capital. Their goal is to make all men independent proprietors. They say that they're working for the common man. They say that they are going to give the ordinary worker an advantage, a leg up when it comes to competing in the new capitalist environment. This is what they want. So now going into the next election, the Whigs have to ask themselves, are they anything like the working man who's losing his job or losing his land? They're really not. The working man has the ear of the Democrats. Okay, the working man is more committed to the Democratic Party. The Whigs tend to be the reincarnation of the Federalist. They're the capitalist business owner more than the man working for that guy. So the Whigs are, no, they're not going to have the ear of the common man. So the Whigs have got to come up with a strategy that works if they're going to win the next election. And here is how they do it. The election of 1840, for a number of reasons, is known as the first modern election, and I think you'll understand why. This is it. The Whigs have finally settled on one candidate, and they take the biggest winner in 1836, William Henry Harrison. And they're going to run him against the incumbent Democrat, Martin Van Buren. That's the election of 1840. Sorry, I forgot to take this little part off there. What are the Whigs thinking? That is two guys running, Martin Van Buren, the Democrat, William Henry Harrison, the Whig. Now, have a good look at Harrison's campaign poster. Harrison and Reform. Look at the sides. To the log cabin, boys. And then there's a picture of the man that would like to be president, William Henry Harrison, and he is at the plow in front of a log cabin. And if you can read the little banner, you got this eagle flying up there. It says William Henry Harrison, the farmer of North Bend. What? William Henry Harrison? Now, guys, William Henry Harrison is not a farmer. William Henry Harrison is a wealthy Whig. He doesn't own a farm. He lives in a big mansion. What are they doing here? Well, they're dressing him up in the language of the Jacksonians. They're dressing him up in the imagery of the Jacksonians. They are trying to appeal to a class of people that they do not have their vote right now. They're trying to look like something they're not. Here's another one. There's William Henry Harrison standing in front of his log cabin. Looks like he's about to start working the earth. William Henry Harrison wouldn't know a damn thing about working the earth. He is, again, an aristocratic guy who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He is not somebody who's going to be seen out there farming. But what are the Whigs trying to do? The Whigs are trying to make this man look like something he is not. They are trying to appeal to a working population that they, as of now, do not have their support. It's genius. This one I like. This they take a shot at Martin Van Buren himself. The cartoon I'm about to show you shows Martin Van Buren taking a drink of White House champagne. Here he is. Oh, look how much he enjoys White House champagne. That's what I like to drink, says Martin Van Buren, a beautiful goblet of White House champagne. Oh, I'm so happy. Now, well, take a look at what happens when Martin Van Buren takes a drink of hard cider. Hard cider would be like the Bud Light of the day, okay? It's the working man's drink. When the working man gets home, he doesn't crack open a bottle of White House champagne. The working man wants a Bud Light, all right? Now take a look at what happened when Martin Van Buren has his Bud Light or his hard cider. Ooh, we don't like that. See? What are we saying about Martin Van Buren? We're trying to say he does not have the ear of the working man. He is not the friend of the working man. Now, he's a Democrat. The Democrats have typically, up to this point, been the party of the working man, and the Whigs are turning that image on its head. They are trying to present themselves as Democrats. They're dressing up in Democratic clothing, and they're painting the opposition as the aristocrats. They come up with one of the first, not the first, but really one of the first campaign songs. You know, no good campaign is without a good campaign song. And it goes something like, oh, who has heard the great commotion, motion, motion, all the country through? Is it the ball a-rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too? And with him we'll beat little Van. Van is a used-up man. And with him we'll beat little Van. Okay, I'm sorry. I know your ear. I've greatly offended your ears. But look at the lyrics to this song and look at what they're trying to tell you. We're trying to say we're the party of the common man. And so when the people go to the polls, look who wins. The strategy worked. William Henry Harrison takes the North, he takes parts of the South, he certainly wins in parts of the Midwest, Michigan and Illinois, or no, sorry, not Indiana. What happened here? But if you're going to remember anything from the election of 1840, you have to remember the great slogan. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison for president. That's the first time in American history when a good slogan has been associated with a presidential run. And you can argue that it's catchy, people can remember it, it rhymes, and he won. Of course, this begins a grand tradition in American politics to try to outdo the other party with the best slogan, such as "He kept us out of war" in 1916, Woodrow Wilson. The return to normalcy, inaugurating the 20s, inaugurating the Republican 20s. Keep cool with Coolidge, small government, Calvin Coolidge. I Like Ike, 1952. And who can forget All the Way with LBJ in 1964. Despite the brilliant campaign, despite all of the money spent on posters and songs, despite all of the grand visions that William Henry Harrison communicated during his campaign, the man did not make it more than 31 days in office. You see, he felt that in order to defend himself against people who thought he was too old, He gave a 2-hour inaugural speech on a bitterly cold March day, ended up getting pneumonia, had to be rushed to his bedroom where he died. March 4, 1841 to April 4, 1841. But what a great campaign the man led. Turn our attention now to the Supreme Court and John Marshall. Still get a couple of opinions regarding the American judiciary. Going back to our friend Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America, he observes that when the American people get intoxicated by their passions or carried away by their ideas, the lawyers apply an almost invisible brake which slows them down and halts them. In other words, mass democracy is checked by the Supreme Court. The impulses that the people often exert or demonstrate are checked by a more sober judiciary. Not everybody likes this idea. Thomas Jefferson, and 76 years old, says, "The great object of my fear is the federal judiciary." Of course, anything with the word federal in front of it gives Thomas Jefferson hives. That body, like gravity, ever acting with noiseless foot and unalarming advance, gaining ground step by step and holding what it gains, is engulfing insidiously the special governments into the jaws of that which feeds them. So, a very different view of the judiciary. Thomas Jefferson fearing big government till the day he died. So let's look at the object of Jefferson's fear. That would be Jefferson's second cousin, John Marshall, a Virginian. Now, the two of them could not have been more opposite. John Marshall had to swear in Thomas Jefferson as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I wonder how the two regarded each other. Did they give each other a glance, wondering just which one would ruin the country first? John Marshall was also in favor of the American Revolution, but he became convinced during the Revolution that these 13 independent and squabbling republics would never hold together. They're going to need a stronger and more coercive government if this enterprise is going to work. And as you know, he jumped on the chance in 1803, ruling in Marbury v. Madison, that the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court alone, had the power to judge the constitutionality of acts of Congress. He was in office from 1801 to 1835, spanning the entire Jacksonian era and ruling against it with an iron gavel the whole way. He was he was not shy about his political views. He was a strong Federalist, and he fought tenaciously for the supremacy of federal powers over that of the states. We're going to look at a few examples. Reminding you of John Marshall's famous ruling in Marbury v. Madison, it is empathetically the province and the duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Now, this is not a view held by everybody. Thomas Jefferson and his Virginia and Kentucky resolutions believed that it was the power of the states to interpret the Constitution and that they could nullify what they believed to be unconstitutional. John Marshall obviously does not hold that opinion, and he's going to make that known in his several rulings. The first one, McCulloch v. Maryland, which takes place in 1819. It has to do with a tiny little state bank in Maryland, which looks at the larger Bank of the United States, which had set up a branch within the Maryland state borders. Well, this Maryland State Bank decides it's going to try to tax the notes, the paper money, issued by a branch of the Bank of the United States. Well, the Bank of the United States doesn't like this one bit, and so it's going to go to the Supreme Court. John Marshall in McCulloch v. Maryland is going to rule that the states have no business taxing the property of the United States. And this is his famous line: the power to tax is the power to destroy. Obviously, anti-federalists, Jacksonian Democrats would agree, and that's why they did not want to give the federal government the power to tax. But whose power is it to tax, says John Marshall? It's the Congress's power to tax. It's the federal government, not the states. So here we see again John Marshall ruling in favor of federal prerogative over states' rights. Take a look at his ruling here very closely, and let's look at the very last part. You can take the time to read this, but I want to point out that he states in the highlighted section, this provision is made in a constitution, his ruling, intended to endure for ages to come, and consequently to be adopted to the various crises of human affairs. He believes in the supremacy of the Constitution and in the Supreme Court's interpretation of that Constitution. This is not to be left up to the states or to any other lesser agency, as he would see it. The next case involves a family in the state of Virginia that is convicted of illegally selling lottery tickets. They're named the Cohens. They don't like this ruling, and they take their case to the Supreme Court, saying that we can sell these lottery tickets. Now, the details of this case are not so important, but the decision is. John Marshall rules in favor of the state of Virginia. Now, this may seem to be a victory for states' rights. It's not, because although he rules against the Cohens, he asserts the right of the Supreme Court. Notice the Supreme Court has the right to review the decisions of the state Supreme Courts in all questions involving powers of the federal government. So, who lost? Well, the state of Virginia kind of lost this one there, although they won the case, because the state of Virginia, their Supreme Court, lost the prerogative to decide for itself. When it went to the Supreme Court, John Marshall ruled in favor of big federal power. The next case we're going to look at is called Dartmouth College v. Woodward, happening in 1819. This goes back to King George III, who granted a charter, a foundation document, the birth certificate, if you will, of this Dartmouth College back in 1769. Now, the state of New Hampshire, the legislature there, voted to amend that charter, to change it for their own ends. Not important what they wanted to do. What is important is that Dartmouth takes the state of New Hampshire to the Supreme Court over this attempt to change their charter. Marshall rules that this charter represents a contract, and state governments have no business impairing contracts. So, again, he limits the power of the states. And this is interesting because this charter took place before there was a state of New Hampshire and before there was a Supreme Court. This is back under England, so one would wonder what kind of authority this contract still has. But nevertheless, the precedent is set. States are not the final authority in contract disputes. The federal government is the final authority in contract disputes, slapping down the state of New Hampshire's attempt and giving power once again to the Supreme Court. The next one is called Gibbons v. Ogden, happening in 1824. Now, this one involves the state of New York, which had attempted to grant a private shipping company the exclusive rights, exclusive access to a waterway that connected New York and New Jersey. Now, this is a very profitable waterway. This is waterborne commerce. This is the ability to ship things to and from New York and New Jersey. And before the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, this is a major water conduit. And a lot of people want to get in there and use it. So a lot of people get upset when the state of New York does this. Other interests are going to sue over this use. John Marshall is going to say the power to regulate, that is the power to prescribe the rule by which commerce is to be governed, this power, like all others, and note, vested in Congress, is complete in itself, may be exercised to its utmost extent, and acknowledges no limitations other than those that are prescribed in the Constitution. The short version, the power to regulate interstate commerce belongs to Congress alone. To, that's right, you guessed it, the federal government, not to the states. Interstate commerce is not the business of the states to regulate. It is the business of the federal government to legislate. So again, slapping down New York like he'd slap down Virginia, like he'd slap down New Hampshire, and he is giving that prerogative to the federal government. Well, John Marshall, when he died, he left a Supreme Court that had enhanced its power and had recognized the power of the federal government over that of the states. A New York newspaper editor wrote on his death, "The chief place in the Supreme Tribunal of the Union will no longer be filled by a man whose political doctrines led him always to strengthen the federal government at the expense of the people." Now, this much is certain. John Marshall will not be there. But I have to point out, the federal government is not done growing. The federal government is not done slapping down state powers. We're going to have periods in American history when we're going to see the surge of states' rights, and we're going to see other periods when we see the surge of the federal government.